This week, our special series Game Changers brings you interviews with people who epitomize the 40 years of China's reform and opening up. Today, let's meet Uli Sigg, who, despite his low-key personality, has never been able to hide his passion and interest towards China for the past 50 years. Before we hear his views toward China's progress, let's learn more about him first.
Uli Sigg is a Swiss famous as an avid collector of Chinese contemporary art. But it was business, not art, that first brought him to China. As an employee of the Swiss company Schindler Elevators, he arrived in Beijing in the late 1970s to establish what would later become the very first joint venture between China and the outside world. This first-hand knowledge of China led to his appointment as Swiss ambassador in the late 1990s, and during his return, further broadened his understanding of the old country. In particular, he watched Chinese contemporary art flourish through the years and began seriously collecting China art pieces. At its height, his collection consisted of around 2,300 works. Thanks to him, Chinese contemporary art is more known to the world.
Can you still recognize the China that you were looking at back in 1979?
It was a country very poor, an economy of scarcity. Everything was in short supply. That was my first dominant impression. The people just in green and blue, and no cars. Kindness of Chinese people, and sometimes the rudeness amongst each other. They all continue to exist.
You are used to it, I guess.
I'm very used to it. I have been object and subject as well of this behavior.
But 1979, first a joint venture between China and a foreign country. What was it like for you to work out a business plan with your Chinese partner?
We are speaking of the very first days of the open door policy, and at that time it was a mere declaration. There were no facts yet. Actually, we were the first ones to set facts.
You were this specimen,
actually,
right?
I was the specimen. Right? I was a life experiment, how to do this.
What were the biggest fights you had with your Chinese partner?
The first fight I remember was, what's a company? You know, there had not yet been any legal framework for what a company is. Does it have a board or a chairman or shareholder meeting? Who is taking decisions? How is a profit and loss statement made? How do you arrive at the bottom line? Is there a tax? What kind of tax? Everything up for negotiation. And then the real fight, what's ownership in China? And how do we define this? Do I actually own something in China, of an entity, of a factory, or I have just some very vague right to something in China? All these issues had to be cleared and were a matter of negotiation and fighting. In the end, it was a negotiation rather than anyone, purely insisting on a point of view.
And what was the Swiss strategy?
First, we had to establish that we are decent human beings, and once you get across this hurdle, you have an open communication.
But sometimes it takes a Swiss, right, to do it. I mean, your country is well known to be neutral, while at the same time recognize China, establish diplomatic relations with China, one of the very few Western countries.
It did in fact help. It did help because of what you just mentioned, our early recognition of China. And it did help because we are the most globalized country in the world. We have a long history of doing trade, of investing abroad, and we must do it in a Swiss way. We are not a power, not a superpower. We have to do it on the same level, eye to eye.
Later, you became the Swiss ambassador to China. That, of course, is a very different work path, I would assume.
True. We in Switzerland do not have this practice of political appointee or the like. So this was a first. to bring someone from the very outside into the position of ambassador. So again, I was a life experiment, I guess. And the reason why I had been appointed was very much my experience in China with creating this very first joint venture and the things around it and knowing the Swiss economy very well. So that's how I came here. In the early days, the Chinese in their communication still suffered from some kind of minority complex, shall we call it that. China became ever more successful, more self-confident throughout the 90s, had a lot of the catching up already behind it, was an economic power, was already big and very big, and got recognized ever more. And so the Chinese, had already come out of this inferiority complex of the past.
Let me ask you a very blunt question. Are the Chinese more like business people, or are they more like artists in your eyes?
Business people in the West, we shape a plan, we draw a strategy, and only if that strategy is clear, we will, launch ourselves to fulfill that goal, whatever it is. The artist is very different. The artist worldwide, he has this white canvas and he just starts somewhere, and he may not know where the process will lead him or her. There is just a confidence. If it's a good artist, there will be a good result. So I see the Chinese business people in particular more in that artist type procedure. Like they start somewhere. It makes them very fast, but it may lead to some errors. But that's the effect of trial and error. But they are very fast. They cover the space very fast. And in the meantime, some Western people may still think about the goal. So these are different procedures, and that's why I say they have something of both, of the artist and of the business person.
Have we already reached, Dr. Sigg, another stage in which China is not necessarily going to be, as it used to be, a studying object, but rather a player?
I think that's not mutually exclusive. I think if the worlds are so far apart as they were only 30 years ago, there is no other way than study each other. Both are players. Both parts of the world are players. So I don't necessarily see an issue.
You have collected over the years more than 2,000 pieces of Chinese contemporary artworks.
For me, it's a unique source of information. Again, speaking as a researcher, it's what concerns the Chinese people, what's reflected in the art. So for me, it's just the most fascinating resource to learn more about what is my ultimate study object, which is China, through its contemporary art.
What about those art collections? It's also controversial. You donated many of them to the M+ Museum in Hong Kong, but at the same time you also sold some of those to the museum as well. So people are saying, wow, why this combination?
Yeah, interesting argument, and I had to speak out and say, compare the situation Bill Gates, Warren Buffett in the US, where nobody ever asked them, why did you not give 100%? But
I didn't know
50%?
that you are as rich as Bill Gates and Warren Buffett.
I am definitely not. That's why you don't know it. But to be more serious, I actually had this combination of sale and gift because Hong Kong offered it to me. I was ready to give it for free to Beijing, Shanghai. We had negotiations. It didn't work out, but Hong Kong was fighting very hard for the collection, building this huge museum, M+, and hoping to have a core collection in this huge museum. And Hong Kong is also China. So for me, the main thing was that it will come back to China. It would be available to the Chinese people to be seen.
And do you think generations of Chinese will be able to understand China through the collections you have presented over there?
That's my experience with many Chinese friends, Chinese visitors in my previous exhibitions elsewhere. And I have often seen Chinese people with tears in their eyes. And they say, you know, I've never seen China recorded, presented, remembered, or projected in this way.
Particularly contemporary China.
Yeah, it's a very rich resource.
At the time when you were starting collecting Chinese contemporary art, it doesn't, quote-unquote, worth much, I mean, in terms of money. But today, it has become such a big business, whether it's galleries or collectors and also artists, the whole chain. How has that changed your perception about Chinese contemporary art?
Of course, it's a global phenomenon, the commodification of art, as some people say, and of art production becoming a kind of industry. So we see this globally. We also see it in China. For very long this was not the case, and not the case in China, because there had not been any market. And that is what idealists, you know, consider the pure art making. There is no commercial element to it. The fact that there is a commercial aspect to art does not necessarily mean that the art is less interesting or less meaningful.
They don't?
It does not necessarily mean that, but it may very often mean that. But it doesn't lead by necessity, you know, to art that is of lesser quality.
People talk about Chinese contemporary art, they say it's quote-unquote twisted from the very beginning. They blame foreign collectors like you for quote-unquote setting the appetite and also the taste of Chinese contemporary art from the very beginning. And then it comes to the very commercialized stage in which there are a lot of more Chinese collectors, and now it reached a stage the world extremely interested in China, therefore all these artworks, whether good quality or bad quality, become hotcakes for everyone.
Well, there is some of all of that. And of course this commodification, commercialization of art has been quite strong in China, because also it's less balanced by art critique, independent art critique, media, by exhibitions, because there are limits on how exhibitions can be done here. Therefore, the commercialization, the auction houses have been so strong. So if you ask me how to remedy this, I created, that's my humble effort, the Chinese Contemporary Art Award, to not necessarily solve all these issues, but to point the finger to these issues, and also an award for independent art critique, so that people would be aware of this situation. Everyone has to contribute to do more. The artists also have to create art which is accessible by a Chinese audience who is not so sophisticated or used yet to see contemporary art as a Western audience may be. That is a contribution they must make. And I think the public must go with an open mind and must sometimes find their own access to it, and maybe do like me. For me, art is like vacationing in my own head.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Uli Sigg, the former Swiss ambassador to China and the largest collector of Chinese contemporary art in the world. In our series Game Changers, we look at pioneers who epitomized the spirit of China's 40 years of reform and opening up. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.